In this lecture, we'll be talking about the end of the Cold War. And we'll start off with the administrations of Ronald Reagan and carry them through the administrations of George H.W. Bush. So we'll be talking about a period from the 1980s into the early 1990s. On the one hand, as we approach the 21st century, where we are now, it becomes increasingly difficult, I think, to get any perspective on events that are so proximate to us. And that goes to the heart of one of the things that really makes the 1980s interesting to me, and that's the fact that I have, very specific memories of the 1980s. And what I remember most was a decade that by and large was lived under the structures of the Cold War. And what makes the era of such interest to me is my recollection even of how so very rapidly the basic foundations of what seemed to structure the world were washed away. By the late 1980s, there were growing signs that the Cold War, as we had known it since the end of the Second World War, might very easily be fading away. And by the very early 1990s, the Soviet Union itself had collapsed. In a matter of just 2 or 3 years, we went from Cold War to no Cold War, to what you might call this brave new world in which there seemed to be one superpower in the world, and that was the United States, so-called hyperpower. Old problems remained, but perhaps idealistically, I can remember having this sense that, hey, the West had won. But more importantly, a sense that a sense of, I won't say drift, but a sense of, okay, what now? And it would take a while before events had occurred that would sort of, I think, begin to reshape the way Americans perceived the world, before Americans escaped fully this sort of Cold War notion of a superpower. And perhaps we still haven't. But these are the sort of tales that I'd like to take up in this lecture. And beginning back with the Reagan administration, I want to talk about foreign policy. It turns out that a great deal of the Reagan administration's foreign policy was focused first on Latin America and then on the Middle East. And by the late 1980s, the two geographic regions are tied together through what will come to be known as the Iran-Contra hearings. And they're tied together politically and legally. But for now, to get some background on that, let's step back. And let's talk about a Central American nation called Nicaragua, where in 1979, the ruling junta, the Somoza government, had been overthrown. And in place of the Somoza government, there had emerged a group of leftists, of communist-leaning political figures, those who had led the charge against Somoza, known as the Sandinistas. As you might imagine, from the Cold War perspective, as it often happened in American history, it was very difficult to conceive of the Sandinistas as anything other than the friend of our enemy, the Soviets. And the fear was, as it had been the case with, the fear of dominoes falling, that a Sandinista government, like a Cuban government friendly with the Soviets, would lead to the expansion of communist ideas across South America and Central America. It had led us in the 1970s to, for lack of a better term, go to bed with some rather unsavory characters in South America to support just absolute butchers because they weren't communists. Well, the U.S. will seek to really harry and harass the Sandinistas, and to contain, if you will, the spread of communism in Central America. In 1982, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, had organized a force in Nicaragua to fight against the Sandinistas. And this force would come to be known as the Contras. Well, that same year, 1982, it became known that the CIA was actively engaged in Nicaragua. And the U.S. would also become sort of surreptitiously through the CIA and organizations involved in another Latin American country, El Salvador. Congress determined that year to block military aid to the Contras. Put a 1-year moratorium on it. 1984, 2 years later, Congress will put a 2-year ban on American assistance. And yet, the wars ongoing, the civil wars, if you will, which, much like the civil wars of the earlier Cold War, were sort of how the great powers, the Soviets and the U.S., sort of played out their global geopolitical game. The wars were big on TV. The vast media coverage in the United States. In the Caribbean, in 1983, in October, the United States launched an invasion of a small island known as Grenada. That was a fascinating episode, in no small part because U.S. soldiers, many of them were using tourist maps to find their way around the island, but essentially students had been taken hostage or were being held or curtailed on the island, however you want to put it. And this relief mission was to go in and release these students, to bring them back to the U.S. I mean, by and large, it was a success. It was a way for the U.S., as it had done so many times, even before the Cold War, to sort of exercise, to display its military prowess to nations in Central and South America. But it was also, it was one of the first successes going back to Vietnam. Remember that the sort of last major American military episodes had been in Iran and during the Ford administration just had not gone well. And the result was, I think, a certain questionable attitude toward the United States military and its capacities. And while Grenada wasn't much, it was something. It was a victory. And maybe it changed the way Americans felt about their military. Shifting to the Middle East very quickly, we have to note that the United States became involved during the Reagan years in the 1980s in episodes involving Libya and Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who had apparently been hosting and backing efforts for terrorist activity to be launched against U.S. targets, including airplanes, one of which was shot down over Scotland. But we need to recall, too, that the United States under Ronald Reagan had sent troops to Beirut, which was at the time involved in a major civil war. And we see here in the 1980s, we see something that's going to become more and more common, I think, in the American mind, something we would recognize, and that's bombs being employed against American troops. The U.S. troops that were sent to Beirut were there as peacekeepers. But their presence, because of the U.S.'s association with Israel and because of other policy issues, but all tied up in the Cold War at this time in the 1980s, their presence solicited an act of terror against those soldiers. And the barracks were bombed when a huge truck full of explosives was driven up to the gate. proper efforts had not been made, as we would be more likely to do now, given all that's happened, to protect those soldiers. And the result was American deaths. It looked rather bad for the Reagan administration. What purpose were those soldiers serving, and why were they allowed to be attacked in that way? The other little thing to mention very quickly is that since the 1970s, one of the reasons that Jimmy Carter had boycotted the 1980 Olympics in the Soviet Union was because the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. This is a country very familiar to us now, or it should be. But understand that it was in the 1970s, the late 70s, that the Soviets had moved into Afghanistan to support a pro-Soviet government. And during the 1980s, under Ronald Reagan's foreign policy, the United States actively supported Afghani and other fighters known as the Mujahideen, who were fighting against Soviet occupation. We supported them with weapons and oftentimes with cash. There was another interesting sidelight. You may recall what had happened with Iran, that the U.S. Embassy had been taken over and embassy personnel had been held hostage under Jimmy Carter's administration. In the 1980s, a war started against Iran by its neighbor, a country by the name of Iraq. And during the 1980s, because Iran was our enemy, in part, the United States actively supported weaponry and also with money, actively supported Iraq in its war against Iran, which was an extraordinarily brutal, bloody affair. You can see the foreshadowing. Even in the last days of the Cold War, the problems beginning to emerge. Well, there are already problems in the Middle East. Think back to the oil embargo of the 1970s for the U.S. But the issues arising in the Middle East and the issues in Latin America. And before this is all over, those two geographic areas will be bound together in a single scandal in the latter days of the Reagan administration. We'll pick up there in the next segment.